Good afternoon and welcome to the joint general session of the ISO Board of Governors and WEIM EIM governing body meeting. Please note all audio connections are muted at the duration of the call to minimize background noise. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded, and with that, I'll turn the call over to Roger Collington. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Again, welcome to our Joint Board of Governors and Western Energy Imbalance Market Governing Body meeting. Let me start out with our roll call of our bodies, and I'll start with you, Chair Bhagwat.
Present.
Governor Borenstein.
Present.
Chair Decker.
Present.
Member Fong.
Here.
Governor Galitova.
Present.
Member Gardner.
Present.
Vice Chair of Governing Body Konziolka.
Present.
Vice Chair of the Board Leslie.
Present.
Member Prescott.
Here.
And Governor Shorey.
Here.
Thank you, governing body members and board members. We have a full quorum for both bodies, and we may proceed. And with that, let me turn to the chair of the governing body, ANITA Decker, for some welcoming comments.
So I too just want to say good afternoon and welcome to the joint meeting of the Cal ISO Board of Governors and the Western Energy Imbalance Market Governing Body. So those of you that are on the phone, eventually, hopefully we'll get to in-person meetings at some point, but thank you for calling in today. So on the agenda, there are a number of items, not the least of which will be the Western EIM Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Enhancements. I know that this is an important issue for many of our stakeholders, as evidenced by the comments and the discussions that we've had heretofore. So I look forward to that presentation today and any additional comments. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Chair Bhagwat.
Again, thank you for attending. Welcome. Good afternoon. I think that both issues, but no, especially the first issue, the resource sufficiency issue, I know that it's been something that's been controversial, and I know it's ongoing. We are aware of that, and I really do welcome comments in this proceeding and in later phases because it's an important issue that we need to get right. Again, welcome, and Roger.
Thank you, Chair Bhagwat. Thank you, Chair Decker. The first item on our agenda is for public comment, and this is public comment that is for items that are not specifically identified on the agenda. For the items on the agenda, you will have an opportunity to comment as well. So, operator, if you can check as to the whether there is any public comment for agenda item number 1.
As a reminder, if you would like to make a public comment, please press #2 on your telephone keypad or click the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen.
Okay, do we have any takers for public comment?
At this time, there are no public comments.
Thank you. The next item, agenda item number 2, is for me, and that's our decision on our joint general session minutes. So I need a motion to approve the joint general session minutes from December 16, 2021 and January 20th, 2022. And let me just note before we proceed that I will do this as a block for both unless there is any objections or any particular comments for one set of the minutes or not. So can I have a motion to approve the December 16, 2021 and January 20th, 2022 joint general session minutes?
This is Prescott. Oh, go ahead, John. Go ahead. So moved.
And second, that was Val?
Yep.
Okay. And let me go ahead and take the vote. Governor Bhagwat?
Aye.
Vote. Governor Borenstein?
Aye.
Chair Decker?
Aye.
Governor Fong, Member Fong?
Aye.
Governor Galitova?
Aye.
Member Gardner?
Aye.
Vice Chair Konziolka?
Aye.
Vice Chair Leslie?
Aye.
Member Prescott?
Aye.
and Governor Shorey.
Aye.
Thank you, Governing Body and Board of Governors. The motion is approved, as it's been 5-0 for each body. The next item on the agenda, let me turn it over to our CEO, Elliot Mainzer, for his CEO report. Elliot?
Thank you, Roger. Good afternoon, members of the Board of Governors and the Western EIM governing body. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I wanted to highlight a number of the items from my CEO report submitted on February 3rd. I think, as we all know, there isn't a person in our industry right now that isn't extremely busy. There's a lot going on. So I want to start right at the top with the progress that we've been making on our extended day-ahead market. I'm really pleased that we came right out at the beginning of the new year. We've had just really extensive and highly engaged stakeholder participation in our 3 working groups centered around supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation, transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation, and greenhouse gas accounting. I think each of these work groups has had at least 100 people attending. And so it's really been very important for us to make sure that folks have their voices heard and at the same time be able to try to keep the process moving and be able to curate the best ideas and consolidate our gains. To that end, we've agreed these last couple of weeks to reduce the number of work groups from 2 to 1 each week, to step back and to try to sort of consolidate some of the thinking and put some real specific examples of market design elements for each of the 3 work groups, and to bring those back to the broader groups for additional consideration. And also, it's important that folks that are working on each of the individual groups have a chance to get a sense of what's happening within all 3 groups and an integrated sense of how the market design is extending. And so on February 16th and March 17th, we're also going to have a set of integrated workshops where we sort of take stock of the work to date, identify some of the interdependencies between the working groups, and allow the stakeholders to stay up to date on the discussions if they've not been able to be engaged in all 3 of the working groups. We know folks have a lot of processes they're engaged in, so we want to make sure that they have that visibility and are able to stay with the progress. We remain on track at this point to publish a straw proposal on the comprehensive market design in mid-April, and to be asking for comments back on that proposal by mid-May. And so again, it's just incredibly important to all of us that we continue to focus on really taking stock of the very best ideas and really working towards a market design that evolves through compromise and a continuing open and transparent process, and ultimately leads us to a clean and elegant EDAM design. So thanks to all of the folks who have been participating in that process. We're quite encouraged with the progress to date. On the wheel-through issue, just wanted to make sure that everybody has just a little bit of a follow-up from the January 20th meeting. We appreciated the affirmative support for our proposal at that point. And again, thanks to all the stakeholders who have come together. I think we all agreeing that really the best solution in the short term was to extend the existing wheel-through rules for another couple of summers to give everybody certainty around those rules while we work on the longer term solution around subscription of transmission across the ISO system. So the proposal was filed with FERC on January 27th. Comments are due on the 14th of February, and we asked the Commission to offer us, please, an expedited rulemaking no later than March 14th, so that folks really can have that certainty around the rules going into the summer, which we know is incredibly important. We're also now in the process of doing some contracting with a third-party entity that's going to help us with the longer duration solution. And we have our work cut out for us to really keep that moving across 2022, but are obviously very committed to that. Of course, today you'll be hearing a lot about the Western EIM resource efficiency evaluation enhancements. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just highlight a couple of things. First of all, this is, again, as we heard at the beginning, such an important topic for so many reasons. It's just incredibly important that we come together and address these foundational issues and just maintain and enhance the trust around the EIM and the market. And I really appreciate, again, all the work that's gone in with stakeholders across the region, my staff, who really, I think, come to today with a set of sort of phase 1 recommendations that we think are actionable with pretty good consensus around them. I think we all, however, do recognize unequivocally that there is more work to be done, and we're ready to turn the page on that and get going literally right on the other side of this meeting. So there are some additional questions and things that we want to answer. And we want to make sure that folks, you hear it directly from myself and others, just our commitment to those principles of accountability and transparency and equity in the application of the rules. And I also want to just make sure, all of us with reliability responsibilities, just make sure that we're being very thoughtful about the enhancements in the rules that we're making to preserve the reliability of the interconnection, to prevent leaning, but also to make sure that the reliability codes and the agreements that we have amongst ourselves as balancing authorities are honored and even strengthened. So that's an important topic that I know we'll all be turning to here in the short term. Of course, last week we were very pleased to release our final Western EIM benefits report for 2021. The fourth quarter benefits at $204.14 million was absolutely fabulous, pushed the full year benefits to a record-setting $739 million for market participants, bringing the total cumulative benefits since the market's inception in 2014 to $1.93 billion. This really is just an amazing outcome, just so appreciative of all the participants and the stakeholders that made this possible. I think another just great piece of evidence of the value of broad regional market coordination. And of course, we're all super excited here towards the conclusion of the winter and spring to be welcoming Bonneville Power Administration, Tacoma Power, Avista, and Tucson Electric into the family of Western EIM entities, which of course will do nothing but to further increase the value and geographic footprint of the market, which we know is such an incredibly important foundation and precursor to the ultimate success of the extended day-ahead market. So thanks again to everybody for that. I want to turn the page for a few minutes and just talk about a couple of the highlights of our recently released 10-year transmission plan and our first ever 20-year transmission outlook. I think for many of us, I know there are many folks here on the phone today who've worked for years trying to really strengthen long-term transmission planning to make sure that we have better coordination between integrated resource planning, power procurement, and interconnection queue processes, and that we have a sense of where we headed in terms of the infrastructure requirements to meet our requisite energy policy goals. This is particularly true in California with our SB 100 objectives, and so the 20-year outlook was an effort to really work very closely with the regulatory bodies in California to get rooted in the fundamentals of the amount of power and resources that it's going to be necessary for California to achieve its SB 100 goals, to take a really hard look at the infrastructure that's going to be necessary to achieve that inside the state, including both onshore and offshore resources, and to really look as well across the West for opportunities for interregional transmission lines that can further help diversify the resource base, provide interconnectivity, and again, strengthen the underpinnings of the Western electricity market. So the 20-year outlook, which we released earlier this week, is, I think, a very, very significant step forward in how we plan and collaborate and strategize about our future infrastructure needs. Just a couple of the figures, the plan envisions about 120 gigawatts of new bulk resources coming onto the system here in the next 20 years. That's in addition to an assumed 30 gigawatts of distributed energy resources. And I want to emphasize that while we continue to focus on the bulk grid, the distributed side of the equation is also very important, and we will be working closely with the retail utilities and the distribution system operators to make sure that the distributed resources can also thrive on the grid. But we have a significant challenge to be expanding and even accelerating the amount of resource coming online. Last year was a pretty good indicator. In 2021 alone, California added 85 clean energy projects to the grid, the most in a single year. 48 of these projects were storage, 16 of them solar projects, and 21 wind projects. And I think our improved transmission planning and coordination with regulatory agencies and other partners is going to help ensure that California can sustain and exceed that pace so that we can have a resource adequate and sufficient transition towards these clean energy goals. And we're really looking forward not only to working with entities inside California, but really continuing to engage across the West with our partners across the region on helping to extend and coordinate and further fortify our transmission grid for long-term resource sufficiency. Of course, along with the 20-year outlook was our 10-year plan, which will be coming before the Board of Governors for approval in March. That plan recommends approval of about $2.9 billion in projects to improve reliability and access to renewable generation in the next decade. And as I mentioned, focuses on some key shorter-term infrastructure enhancements that will fortify reliability at the California grid and open up new resource development opportunities so we can continue to meet our resource adequacy obligations. So transmission coordination, the synchronization of power and transmission planning, procurement and interconnection queuing is going to be a major focus for us here over the course of next year. Really, really appreciate the collaboration with the California Energy Commission, the California Public Utilities Commission, and the many utilities across the West who've participated with us in helping to make this plan possible. So thank you very much. Of course, we're now into early February. So far, knock wood, the winter season has been fairly uneventful. Of course, we all watched the snowpack in December and got quite encouraged by that, only to see a very, very dry January and early February materialize. But we're now, of course, turning our attention to summer reliability and really ramping up our activities in that realm. We will, of course, we take some heart in knowing that there's a significant amount of new resource that's being planned to come onto our grid here just in the next 6 months. By June 1st, 2022, we're anticipating an additional 2,100 megawatts of storage, 1,200 megawatts of solar, 200 megawatts of wind, 40 megawatts of hydro, and 30 megawatts of natural gas and 11 megawatts of biofuels, which totals 3,581 megawatts, of which about 2,180 will be available at net peak when our grid tends to experience its greatest stress. Of course, the hydro conditions looked really fabulous in December. We're now experiencing some degradation on that front. We have to watch very carefully into February and March. But generally, I would say conditions going into the summer are, I think, relatively better than last year. I think we're still using the guardedly optimistic nomenclature. September net peak continues to be the time of the year that we think we have the highest likelihood of stress grid conditions. Of course, as we go into the summer, we have a huge number of coordination activities getting ready. We will be hosting another summer readiness leadership roundtable this April to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to ensure reliability. We also have a number of other important activities related to summer readiness and better coordination, planning, and communications. These include, as I've noted, the reliability coordinator system restoration drills and participation from our grid operators in joint emergency training sessions with Southern California entities. We've begun planning for our annual summer outlook meetings for the ISO balancing authorities and the reliability coordinator in the West. We'll also continue the practice from last year of holding monthly meetings with the Emergency Load Reduction Program Board and monthly meetings from April to October with the Investor-Owned Utility Grid Control Center and Demand Response Program representatives. So communication coordination, infrastructure readiness, not to mention getting this next generation of resources onto the grid as efficiently as possible is just a huge priority for us here going into summer 2022. The last thing I will just mention, I think as was noted at the top of this call, I think all of us are just quite frankly aching for more interpersonal engagement with our peers. It's coming up here on 2 years, right, of this pandemic. We just had another, I think like a lot of folks, a pretty flash outbreak of Omicron to quite a few people in our workforce, forcing us to sort of step back and put another round of shorter term, even tighter restrictions on access to our building. But as the pandemic and as the Omicron appears to be settling down, now there's talk of things moving from pandemic to endemic. We are guardedly optimistic that we will be able to meet our mid-March target of bringing people back into the ISO and Lincoln facilities on a hybrid 3-day, 2-day schedule. We are not planning to have vaccination requirements, but we are likely to continue requiring some level of testing depending on the epidemiology and how the disease is processing at that time. But I think all of us are really excited to get back to some semblance of normality, and certainly hope that in the not too distant future we'll be able to host these type of events in person as well. So that concludes my report. There's a lot happening. Thank you all for your engagement. Looking forward to the conversation this afternoon, and please let me know if you have any questions on the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. The next item on our agenda is the EIM Governance Review Committee update, and I will hand this over to Stacey Crowley, our Vice President of External Affairs, to introduce.
Good afternoon, members of the Board of Governors and the Western Energy Imbalance Market Governing Body. I'm Stacey Crowley, as Roger said, and I'm just here to do a brief introduction to Therese Hampton, the chair of the Governance Review Committee. She's going to provide a few updates, and I will hand it over to her.
Great. Thanks, Stacey, and good afternoon. Thank you to the joint boards for the opportunity to provide you with an update on the Governance Review Committee. First, I want to start by offering terrific thanks to both CAISO staff and to all of you for the swift process of selecting the new Governance Review Committee members. It was less than 2 months ago that I was here before you, and we were talking about the vacancies that we had. And with your quick action, we now have new members that were able to join our Governance Review Committee executive session on January 21st. So they were able to assist with the planning of our upcoming public meeting, which I'll talk to you a little bit about in a minute. And in addition, we've had the opportunity in advance of that public meeting to have new member orientation briefings. So they now have the background and the context for the work that we have ahead. So thank you for that. Appreciate that. When I last briefed you in December, I had indicated that the GRC felt the most appropriate place to start our efforts was with a public meeting about the scope of the effort before us. And that public meeting is scheduled for next Thursday, February 17th. And as I mentioned in December, the GRC views our current efforts as an evaluation of those elements of governance that are implicated by the EDM market design, and not a reevaluation of all governance issues previously explored by the GRC. So we want to hear from stakeholders about what elements of governance they believe are implicated by the potential EDM market design. So that'll be a big focus of our public meeting next week. We also are going to ask for written comments on that as well. We're also planning to run the governance process in parallel with the market design development, and we offer proposals in a timely manner relative to the market design proposals. So we're also seeking public input on that approach and timeline. We look forward to getting stakeholder input both at the meeting next week and in writing, and we'll use that input to determine what issues will need to be addressed in our proposal documents that we would bring forward to all of you. So that's the update I have today, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Any questions for Therese? And operator, can you check with the public and see if there are any public questions for Therese Hampton?
As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by pressing #2 or clicking on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And at this time, I don't see any questions.
Thank you, operator, and I don't see any hands raised. So why don't we move to agenda item number 5. Agenda item number 5 is our decision on Western EIM resource sufficiency evaluation. And let me first note for the record that we have received 3 public comment letters from Bonneville Power Administration, PowerX, and NV Energy. And those letters have been provided to the governing body as well, to the Board of Governors. And with that, let me turn it to Anna McKenna, Vice President, Market Policy, and for her introduction.
Roger, good afternoon, Board of Governors and governing body members, colleagues, and members of the public. I am pleased to introduce today's decision item on the WEIM resource efficiency evaluation enhancements. This comes to you as a joint decisional item under our governance classification. I will shortly turn this over to Greg Cook, Executive Director of Market and Infrastructure Policy, who's going to walk us carefully through the proposal. But before I do, I did want to take a little bit of a time to thank all stakeholders who participated very actively in this initiative, as well as ISO staff and their continued efforts in enhancing the ISO resource efficiency evaluation, looking very closely to all the inputs that go into the test, as well as considering carefully the implications of failing the test from both an economic and reliability perspective. And although our efforts to improving the performance, accuracy, and consequences of the tests are not done, we do believe and we are confident that the changes we are proposing here today are a step in the right direction and necessary to take at this time so that we can implement these by this summer. Indeed, we're not done, and we've already started taking actions on continue to work on these issues, and we look forward to the next phases of this initiative and working with stakeholders on making sure we come up with some other potential changes as necessary. With that, I will now ask Greg Cook to walk us through the proposed changes we are putting forth today.
Thanks, Anna. Good afternoon, Chairs Decker and Bogwat, governing body, and ISO board members. So I'm here to present our proposal for the EIM Resource Efficiency Evaluation Enhancements Phase 1. We're calling these Phase 1 because these are the first set of enhancements that could be developed and we're trying to have implemented by this summer. As Anna noted, we're also planning subsequent phases to address further enhancements. To reiterate, as Anna noted as well, this does fall under the joint authority of the Western EIM governing body and the ISO board because it does apply to EIM balancing authority areas in their capacity as participants in the Western imbalance energy market. Next slide, please. So let me start with a little background. We are proposing several enhancements to improve the accuracy of the resource sufficiency evaluation. And the resource sufficiency evaluation is put in place to test whether balancing authority areas have scheduled or bid sufficient supply to prevent leaning. Now, when we're thinking about leaning in this context, we think leaning would occur when an EIM balancing authority area would participate in the EIM without sufficient capacity or ramping flexibility to cover its demand. And this is an important concept because the real purpose of the Western EIM was to provide economic power exchanges, not to simply allow balancing authority areas to resolve, we view as short-run capacity shortages by importing power from other balancing authority areas. So the resource efficiency evaluation includes both a capacity and a flexible ramping sufficiency test. So the capacity test is meant to measure whether there's sufficient scheduled and bid-in supply to meet the forecast demand. And then the flexible ramping sufficiency test does an assessment of whether there's sufficient ramping capability to meet 15-minute load variations. And the way the tests are implemented, if you fail either of these tests, then it results in limiting additional transfers into or out of the balancing authority area that failed test. There's also a balancing test in place, and that was put in place to assess whether base schedules are submitted that can either under or over schedule supply relative to demand. Now, this was designed to provide some financial incentives for base schedules to closely align with forecast demand. And the motivation here was to mitigate the potential for using base schedule strategies in order to systematically derive profits out of the market. So we do apply financial penalties to the EIM entities that fail that balancing test. Next slide, please. So we are proposing some enhancements to the capacity test, and this is in an effort to more accurately account for the available supply. The first provision is that we would only count capacity that is online or that the real-time market could start for the upcoming hour. And this avoids including capacity that would be unavailable, particularly from resources returning from outages. And so this provides an improvement to the capacity test because currently it would include all capacity that was offered into the real-time market and would not consider the time needed to start resources. Now, I want to dive down a little more into this provision because there is some concern that we didn't go far enough when proposing these provisions. And the reason of this is the real-time market includes two commitment processes. One is the short-term unit commitment process that has a 4.5-hour look ahead. And then there's the real-time pre-dispatch process where we're looking from an hour to an hour and 3/4 ahead. So in the real-time market, that short-term unit commitment process will allow for the day-ahead commitments of units with longer start times. And it does this by using a multi-hour look-ahead optimization of resources to meet the forecast demand. But then some resources that would have been available on that longer time frame can be unavailable when we get into the 15-minute market if during that short-term unit commitment process, the resource was found to not be needed to meet that forecast load. Now, this raises a couple of issues. The first one is that capacity that cannot come online in the time to provide capacity for the hour being tested would be unable to meet the capacity needs for that hour. And this is something that was noted by several of the EIM entities in the stakeholder process. However, the concern we had was it would also be very inefficient to commit longer start thermal resources when high renewable resource output is expected, because this could require curtailing renewable resources to accommodate that longer start resource. And I think a way to look at this is a simple example. Take, for example, in the short-term unit commitment process, looking ahead 3 hours, and it has the option of scheduling an import for $100 or keeping a long start unit online for $150. It'll find that it's more economic to schedule that import. But then as we get closer to real time, we may find that import's no longer available. For example, it could have been backed by, say, Wyoming wind, and the wind subsided. And so due to that uncertainty, that resource is no longer available, but also that the short-term unit commitment turned off that long start resource, and it's no longer able to get it back. So a couple of observations here is that, first, this is just the capacity test. We also have the flexible ramping test that looks at ensuring we have enough ramping capability throughout the hour. And second, I think we really need to look at this more as a normal day concern. So when we're not in those really high peak days, we don't have some of the reliability concerns that we would on a peak day. And so these economic considerations are very important. I think it's not so much of a concern on peak days because we do tend to see all resources committed during those days. We're also working on a measure that would potentially deem balancing authority areas as automatically failing the resource sufficiency evaluation under emergency conditions. I'll get into that a little more in a minute. But in any event, we have also committed that in the subsequent phase of this, phase 1B, we'll be conducting further analysis to quantify the capacity that is impacted by this proposal. So moving on to the next piece, we're also proposing to remove the net load uncertainty from the capacity test. This was originally included as part of the summer 2021 market enhancements. And we're doing this because we found that the way the calculation is currently conducted can at times be inaccurate, which can cause some spurious capacity test failures. So we'll be looking into improving that methodology. And similarly, we're also proposing to remove the intertie uncertainty adder from the capacity test requirement, because we've also found the way this is calculated, it can at times be inaccurate as well. So in the subsequent phase of the initiative, we'll be looking into improving those calculations as well as to how to appropriately incorporate both the net load uncertainty as well as the intertie uncertainty back into the capacity test. Next slide, please. We're also proposing 3 enhancements to the flexible ramping test. Again, this is to more accurately count ramping capability. The first one is in the event we're in very tight conditions and there's a supply shortfall that occurs, we would then adjust the load forecast to account for the shortfall in that hour to determine the ramping capability requirements. So really the reason for doing this is to ensure that the market schedule that's used for the flexible ramping test does not have an artificially biased ramping requirement as a result of the market schedule would not fully balance supply and demand. So the starting point, without this, the starting point for calculating the ramping needs is inaccurate. Second, we're proposing to account for multi-stage generators ramping capability when they transition between configurations. You know, we're commonly talking about combined cycle generators here, and when the market transitions a multi-stage generator through its forbidden operating regions, it'll do this in the least number of intervals possible. So this enhancement will then include that ramping capability that occurs during that transition in the flexible ramping test. And then finally, we're also providing some enhancements for calculating storage capability for providing ramping capability, and primarily considering storage as state of charge when we calculate the ramping capability. And so this will provide a more accurate accounting of storage resources ramping capability, because their flexibility would now be based on that state of charge as well as their charging and discharging dates. Next slide, please. So we're also proposing some enhancements to more accurately account for imports and exports in the resource efficiency evaluation. We're proposing to now exclude schedules that come out of the hour ahead scheduling process if their transmission profile E-tag is not submitted by the final hourly resource efficiency evaluation run, which occurs at 40 minutes prior to the hour. The reason for this is that we have little assurance that those imports and exports that are not tagged by that time would be actually delivered to the market. And in fact, our 15-minute market dispatches these to zero if they're not tagged up. And so this enhancement, combined with penalties that we have for undelivered imports, provides assurances that the imports and exports included in the resource efficiency evaluation will actually be delivered. And then next, what I already talked about, we're also, for the imports and exports, removing that component that accounts for those undelivered imports and exports, that uncertainty for the interties. So, well, again, we'll be looking at improving that methodology in the subsequent initiative, revising that before we put it back in place. Next slide, please. We're also having a proposal to exclude the ISO balancing authority area from the allocation of balancing test penalty revenues. Now, the balancing test requires that base schedules must be within 1% of the forecast demand in order to avoid a financial penalty. The ISO balancing authority area is not subject to the balancing test because it uses the day-ahead market and does not submit base schedules to the real-time market. So we believe this is appropriate. That balancing test is really developed to provide financial incentives for accurate base schedules. However, the ISO is currently eligible for the allocation of balancing test penalty proceeds, which we do not believe is appropriate. So we're proposing to exclude the ISO from the allocation of those funds. And because again, allocating the balancing test penalty proceeds to ISO market participants also doesn't provide any types of incentives for scheduling behavior because those schedules are determined by the day-ahead market. Next slide, please. Finally, we're also looking at some enhancements when certain actions EIM balancing authority areas take outside of the ISO market. The first one is to allow EIM balancing authority areas to reduce the load forecast used in the resource efficiency evaluation to represent dispatches of smaller demand response programs. Under the current rules, only in EIM entity demand response programs in excess of 4% of their load is allowed to be incorporated into the demand response forecast that we use in the resource efficiency evaluations. So we're proposing to eliminate that limitation. But we're also saying that EIM entities that do use demand response programs are going to be required to sign an attestation that the adjustments made to the demand response forecast do actually correspond to the expected performance provided by their demand response programs. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, but we are considering measures that would automatically deem a balancing authority area as failing the resource sufficiency evaluation under certain emergency conditions. We feel like this needs some more work, and we need to work on this item with stakeholders in order to develop some clear criteria for what those emergency conditions would be. So we will be working on that and plan to bring that to the March joint EM governing body and Board of Governors. Next slide, please. So finally, in addition, we're also providing some additional transparency enhancements for the resource efficiency evaluation. We're providing some system enhancements to provide additional data, and this will allow the EIM balancing authority areas to better understand their resource efficiency evaluation requirements. And this additional data will enable the EIM balancing authority areas to spot check their performance under the resource efficiency evaluation and provide for validation of inputs to the capacity and flexible ramping tests to help ensure the results are accurately calculated. And then finally, as you all know, the Department of Market Monitoring has assumed a primary role in resource efficiency evaluation reporting and analysis. And they're also looking to define what standard performance and reporting metrics should be used to evaluate the accuracy of the resource efficiency evaluation. Next slide, please. So I think, in large, stakeholders do support the proposal, and primarily because they do view that it does provide incremental improvements to the resource efficiency evaluation. There was a lot of feedback that we should look at further consideration of additional topics in subsequent phase of the initiative, which we have agreed to do. One of the primary issues is looking at whether and how to incorporate the ISO's load conformance activities into the resource efficiency evaluation, as well as how export transfers are cleared in the ISO's hour ahead scheduling process. So again, we have committed to resolving these issues as soon as possible, and we'll be starting a phase 1B of this initiative, and we have a workshop scheduled next week, February 16th. Next, some stakeholders are concerned that the enhancements for compounding capacity for the resource efficiency evaluation would not go far enough. I think this primarily goes to what I was discussing earlier about the temporal constraints that we see between the short-term unit commitment process and the real-time pre-dispatch process. Again, we believe our proposal is aligned with the leaning principles and how the real-time market functions, but we will provide additional analysis in the next phase of this initiative. And then finally, some stakeholders argued that the hourly EIM participation should be limited following the declaration of energy emergency alert stage 2. We looked at this, but we did have some concerns with this proposal, and therefore we believe that it needs further consideration to determine what the appropriate criteria would be. So we plan on working that out with stakeholders and bringing a proposal to the March EIM governing body and ISO board meeting. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we're requesting that the ISO board and the EIM governing body approve this set of enhancements to the resource efficiency evaluation. Again, these are incremental enhancements that will provide a more accurate assessment of whether balancing authority areas supply is sufficient to meet their demand. It also will more appropriately allocate the penalty revenues. And again, we're continuing to work with stakeholders to further enhance the accuracy of the resource efficiency evaluation and subsequent initiatives that have been planned. And we'll get underway next week. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Greg from the board?
Greg, if no one else does, I have a question. This is Ashford. I'm speaking purely as my capacity as a board member. I have no problems with the proposals for today. I have real concerns about combining some sort of mechanism for finding people to be not resource sufficient after an emergency is declared, combined with our current sort of penalty, which is cutting them off from the EIM market, that strikes me as being a reliability disaster. And I have to tell you, all of us should be worried about reliability before everything else. And if that proposal was to come forward next time, I would need some serious convincing. I just want to get that on the table because I was looking at this and that just does not seem right to me. And it sounds like you're not going to consider the penalty issue with the next phase. And for me, that's a real problem.
And if I can just weigh in and second that, Ash, I was going to say pretty much the same thing. That is one of my concerns. I am completely on board with what we're voting on today. But the penalty of cutting entities off from the market seems like it's not only not the best, it sort of goes in the wrong direction. I have another concern I will raise, and maybe I know there are going to be other commenters and maybe they can address these. The uncertainty analysis, which also we're not voting on today, I am still, after reading the memo and the analysis from DMM and the analysis from MSC, I did not see anything that gets around this fundamental problem of estimating uncertainty based on very small numbers, and that is likely to lead us into trouble of unreliable estimates of uncertainty. So those are the two concerns I have that I wanted to put out there now for future proposals.
If I may, this is Mark Rothfitter. On the first issue, we agree with you, and it is one of the reasons, but it's not the complete reason, why we need additional time to consider the discussion about what is the triggering event, an emergency that would trigger either a failure, and maybe more importantly, what is the consequences if such an event is triggered? Do we cut or freeze transfers, or is there other mechanisms to better incentivize but not cut off transfers when they most are needed and maybe of most value? So it is part of that mix of discussion that needs to continue to happen. So we appreciate that concern.
Yeah, Mark, this is Elliot. I'll just add, and I appreciate the articulation of that as well, and that it's threading that needle between the accountability and the responsibility and the avoiding of systematic leaning, which is so important, but at the same time adhering to the core precepts of the reliability code and not effectively exacerbating reliability risks. So thank you for articulating that, and those will be key guiding principles for us as we re-engage next week on this topic.
So this is Anita, and so I've got a couple questions for Greg. On slide 12, can you go back to slide 12? On the demand response and people making an attestation, what kind of pushback have you had about making the attestation?
I'd like to take that.
I was on mute. Yeah, we had a couple of stakeholders that were, provided some concerns that they didn't believe the attestation was necessary. However, we believe there needed to be, some kind of provision in place that would at least provide some certainty that they have, confidence that the adjustments that they're making to those load forecasts are consistent with what they would expect to receive from their demand response programs.
I guess my question around that, Greg, is they're not attesting now. So, why would there have to be? I'm wondering if we're going to head down the path of attest, because it didn't look like that was very well supported in the comments. And so I'll just move on. If you can go to slide 14. And so you talked about the consequences and doing it and working on it in the next phase. So when you're using the term next phase, are you talking about in the 1B phase, or are you talking about in the actual phase 2 phase?
You're talking about the consequences for failure, just to be clear.
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think which one and which bullet. Yeah, it was the second bullet. So
the second bullet. Okay. Well, the second bullet was really related to, the proposal for the capacity test, where, how we would determine to count capacity that is either online or that the real-time market could start for the upcoming hour. And so this really got into, whether we would include capacity, all the capacity that was offered into the short-term unit commitment process and could have been available for that hour, but versus where some entities want us to go forward and say, well, even if uncertainty arose and which resulted in when we got to the real-time pre-dispatch process, that there was insufficient capacity now available because those long start units were no longer available, that should also result in a failure. And again, I kind of went through why we thought, that was an economically inefficient thing to do.
My question was, you said you were going to work on it in the next phase. My question was, is that phase 1B or is it going to be in phase 2? So my question is a when.
Yeah, okay. That would be a phase 1B. We'll be addressing that in the upcoming phase. Phase 2 is going to be more focused on the consequences of failure issue, because that's a lot of a more entangled issue that we're going to have to deal with.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if there's no other questions at this point, we can move to the Department of Market Monitoring comments by Ryan Kolinsky. Ryan, are you on the line?
Yeah, hey, do you want to, let's see, the slide says Scott Harvey from MSC. Would you like him to go first?
Sure, why don't we do that? That wasn't the order I had, so sorry about the confusion. So, well, now the slides are changing as we speak. You guys are testing me.
Roger,
so let's go ahead.
the public agenda I have has MSC going first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, my notes got reversed, so I apologize. Thank you. So Scott Harvey from the MSC.
Yeah, this is Scott Harvey. I've turned on my microphone and video, and hopefully you can see me. Good afternoon, chairs and members. As discussed in our opinion, the MSC basically supports the CAISO resource sufficiency proposal. And I'm going to briefly review just 4 elements of that proposal that are discussed in greater detail in our opinion. First, we support the CAISO proposal to temporarily remove the net load uncertainty requirement and the intertie deviation requirement from the resource sufficiency capacity evaluation. And as Severin mentioned, we discussed the statistical problems with the current design at some length in our opinion. However, while we support this change, we also agree with a number of stakeholders that the CAISO needs to move expeditiously to develop, test, and implement replacement designs for calculating these requirements, and not just have no requirement in the capacity test, and also to replace the uncertainty requirement in the flexibility test, which has these issues that are not yet going to be addressed. And this review needs to include making more information available on the design of the quantile regression method. Exactly how is it going to work? How is it going to address these issues about sample size that we talked about and Severin mentioned? More complete information on the quantile regression performance and on the timeline. The second topic I want to briefly comment on is that we support the CAISO's decision to not include load conformance adjustments in the HASP that are made in HASP and RPD in the resource sufficiency test. And our view is that such a design would not serve any purpose relevant to avoiding undue leaning on the pool, but would adversely impact CAISO reliability. Now, with such a change in place, CAISO operators would, of course, take actions to avoid those reliability impacts. So they take additional ad hoc actions to avoid failing the resource sufficiency test and to make enough capacity available for flexibility. But those that will basically have the same effect and purpose as load conformance adjustments, but having additional out-of-market adjustments is not going to serve the efficiency and operation and price signals of the the Western Energy Imbalance Market. So we don't think that's the appropriate way to go, and we support the CAISO's proposal. On the other hand, we share the market participants' concern and stakeholders' concern with the level of transfers and investigated the reasons for the high levels of CAISO EIM transfer imports during stress system conditions this summer. And we identified some anomalies in the FlexiRamp prices during these periods that we believe contributed to the high levels of EIM transfers into the CAISO. After discussion with the CAISO conducted some investigation of what was happening and the reasons for those prices, and identified anomalies in the way FlexiRamp prices that are currently being calculated that likely contributed to the observed outcomes. Now, based on the pricing data we reviewed and the data the CAISO has shared with us regarding the location of FlexiRamp schedules on July 9, for example, there are strong indications that the pricing issues caused the 50-minute software to schedule EIM transfers into the CAISO to create more FlexiRamp capacity inside the CAISO to meet the CAISO locational requirement while eliminating unloaded capacity in the rest of the Western EIM because it has a zero price for FlexiRamp. And this pattern likely has contributed to stakeholder concern with the CAISO leaning, but the issue is not CAISO leaning. It wasn't a matter of the CAISO not having unloaded capacity. It was the software was operating to create all the unloaded capacity in the southern region within the CAISO. And that produced these anomalous outcomes. So we believe these pricing issues are important. They have to be discussed with EIM stakeholders on an expedited basis. And the discussion of these issues needs to not only focus on what do we do about these pricing issues, but also on what's the timeline and effectiveness of the nodal deliverability test, which is wrapped up in these pricing issues, and whether design that the CAISO is implementing is going to work not only for the CAISO, but also for all the EIM entities and send an appropriate price signal for FlexiRamp. The third topic is we agree with the stakeholders that the CAISO needs to include discussion of the inconsistencies between HASP, the 15 market, and RTD, and the structure of the resource sufficiency evaluation in the next phase. And relying on CAISO ad hoc operator actions such as load conformance adjustments to resolve these inefficiencies isn't a long-run strategy, and even more ad hoc adjustments may be needed by EIM entities to manage the impact of the inconsistencies in the real-time dispatch. Fourth and finally, and following up on some of the comments of the members and governors, that we support the need for reconsideration of penalties for failing the resource sufficiency test. And on the one hand, the penalties need to deter undue leaning on the pool when the pool is short of capacity and make sure that that EIM entities don't have to shed load because of undue leaning by another entity. However, there is no undue leaning if the Western EIM is flush with capacity and a particular member is dealing with short-run problems and shortages. And it may even be the case that we've created a powerful engine in the Western EIM redispatch that may be a better mechanism for moving capacity around than emergency purchases, because it'll happen automatically and part of the software, take account of all the redispatch. So in summary, we support the proposed changes, but there's more. We believe there's more to be done. I'll be glad to take any questions if there are any.
Any questions for Dr. Harvey?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Ash.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, Scott. That was great. You actually went a little further than I or Ash did in our concerns about the penalty. In talking, and I'll just sort of put this out there and get your comments and maybe others' comments, I got the sense that there is a conscious decision about the WEIM that we do not want entities using it to clear short-run discrepancies. And that's just not the purpose of this market. And your last statement that perhaps we've actually created a great engine to do it sort of goes in the other direction. And I guess I will want to understand, again, this isn't for today, but going forward, is this a powerful engine that we should be actually utilizing, or is it actually something that we really want entities to be pretty trued up when they come into the WEIM and not be using it to, or be actually penalizing use of it to address short-run imbalances in their system. And then separately, I don't think the MSC memo or the DMM memo really addresses this issue of uncertainty in terms of solutions. And I didn't either. I think this is a really hard problem. It's where you have to make forecasts about the tails of a distribution based on thin samples, because if you go back too far, you end up just with irrelevant samples. And I understand the solution is, because you got to do it, is to trade off those problems, but I don't know exactly if there's some clever solution. Quantile regression, I will tell you, is not a clever solution. It is a technique, but it doesn't solve this problem. But so any thoughts you have on either of those questions, I'd be interested in.
This is Scott Harvey. On the first question, I want to make sure there's a distinction I made. I said on the one hand, we don't want to have undue cleaning when the pool is short. And that's true of all power pools back before we had ISOs, and it's true of all the ISOs. We don't want someone to not have enough capacity and cause others to have to shed load. So there's a situation of when there's not enough capacity, and the person that comes to the table without enough capacity should be the one that has to shed load, not the rest of the other entities in the EIM. But then there's the situation where there's plenty of capacity in the Western EIM. And, looking at some of the failures, we see people failing during the solar, glut, and other times where we probably have lots of capacity, and it's an engine for individual balancing areas. If they're having a problem that came up suddenly, we want to get them through it and not cut off their supply in a time where we're not short at all. We got plenty. But there is a real issue of we don't want people to create undue leaning and cause other members to have to shed load.
So that speaks to penalties being somehow measured based on the overall availability of power in the system.
Right, and if the FlexiRamp product worked as it did, we could say we don't have a problem when the shadow price of FlexiRamp is zero in the region. But unfortunately, it doesn't work, so we can't do that. So there are a lot of things wrapped up in the fact that the FlexiRamp product doesn't work right.
Okay.
On your second question, it is going to be very difficult, and quantile regression doesn't solve it by itself, but it may enable, there are multiple problems, one of which is the look-back method can have a high uncertainty value associated with net load uncertainty for a balancing area that actually already has low wind and solar, and it can't go down. So by using the regression method to have a more forward-looking assignment that takes account of current system conditions, we might be able to do better. And that also ties into, if you can control for the level of solar output and the level of wind output, maybe you can look back further in time. And that history isn't necessarily irrelevant. And, one of the other hats I wear for some of the ISOs is collateral policy. And, you have to balance the same balance between looking at a small number of data points to estimate the tail versus focusing on, okay, well, things are changing a lot. And you have to balance that, but you have to be conscious of both things. Are there any other questions?
Thanks, Scott.
This is John. Did Osh have something first?
No, Severin asked my question.
So if I may, this is John Prescott in the governing body. So I agree with what Osh started off with and Severin supported, and Dr. Harvey as well. But I want to drill down just a little bit. And certainly when I look at the support letter that came in from NV Energy, there's a statement in there in bold that talks about no market rule should be the cause of or contribute to a blackout. I totally get that and I agree with it. I think it would be bad policy to have a very strict rule that if you pass the or you fail the RSC, then you're cut off from this market. However, I think it's extremely important that we stop and think about this may be something that could help us in a very unexpected, unplanned for short-term event. What I'm a little bit anxious about is if this was a tool available to me and if I was operating a system, it might make me make longer-term build resource or use demand-side management resources. It might make me think I don't have to have those in place if I could rely on this market to get through those short-term issues. So I think it's a really fine line we have to walk here to make sure that this market doesn't send signals out to the participants that they have to build less or have less tools in their own toolbox to get through these things, and have it be available perhaps for very unexpected short-term events. And I just think that's an important distinction I wanted to put out there.
I think we also have a hand up for Rob Konziolka.
Thank you. Dr. Harvey, I have a question, then I have some comments. My question is not directly related to the specific memo you made, but just in general, the resource efficiency evaluation was intended to be a basic approach in ensuring there is resource adequacy or enough resources by each BAA. And it was, looked at as being a threshold. And based upon the work that the MSC has done, do you see that the future of MSC is necessarily to have it more and more complex to get to the right answer and to get to where the outcome is acceptable? Or are there other avenues besides taking the analysis that contained in the MSC memo? Is there some other option besides going down that particular direction?
I think I share your concern with getting a model that's more and more and more complicated to apply the resource sufficiency test that might produce more and more and more anomalous results. So we want to balance accuracy and, in a theoretical sense with what's actually going to be accurate in a real-time calculation. And, I wonder about some of the Western EIM entities that I see failing during particular times of day, whether they really didn't have enough capacity, whether there was really a problem. So, yeah, on that, but on the other hand, I think in the end, you do have this issue of we don't want someone to, when you're in a pool, you don't want to have, Arizona to have to shed load because Nevada's short and there isn't enough. And we're going to need some rule to deal with the load shedding and who has to do it when we're short, or even when it's a matter of who has to activate their demand response, who has to take these actions. We don't want, we want that to fall on the entity that didn't make the procurement decisions that, that John was just talking about. So that there's a balance here of, and particularly I think the balance is when we're in the solar peak and we got lots of energy awash in the Western EIM, we don't want to have people, as Greg and Mark said, putting extra thermal capacity on that's just going to back down thermal resources because they need to do it to pass the test. But on the other hand, we want to have a good test and a strict test when we're in really tight conditions and people have to be activating demand response, people have to be taking emergency actions, and maybe somebody has to shed load.
Dr. Harvey, thank you. First of all, I agree with everything you just said, and I was going to save these comments for later, but I might as well go ahead and say them now, seeing as we've got the reliability issue on the table. Back in December, I tried to emphasize the point of let's not maybe always go down the path of more and more complications or more complexity, and let's make certain reliability is core and fundamental, because it does not make sense having a market that somehow is not contributing to reliability. I'll do quick two examples, and this is before EIM existed. And I remember talking to our energy procurement group during two very stressful situations. And we talked about, boy, if we had a market then these types of things could provide solutions instead of constraints. And one was in a situation where there is was a wildfire. We could see it coming. We knew we were going to either have the line, actually it was a corridor, interrupted, or we were in a position to where we could interrupt the corridor in advance of the fire and then maybe jump with the coordination and have a prescribed burned underneath. So it was a little more controlled. The challenge is in that situation, when it's short term, such as we're talking about, you're in a position to where, okay, I have sufficient resources right now. I know I'm going to have them interrupted. What are my options? I'm not in an EEA event, but once I have that curtailed, I am possibly in an EEA event. Why can't I rely on the market to assist in resolving that issue? The other is a little more along those lines where you could have a contingency, which then puts you into an EEA event. And all of a sudden now, when we take a look at the bilateral market, it has shifted from where it used to be into the EIM. And now your timeframes are very different when you aren't relying on the EIM, and then you're going back to a bilateral market in real time. And then you take a look at the time difference that you can schedule energy. It's not going to work, or it doesn't work. You are talking about going from your 15-minute time frame and having solution right there to where you may be looking out at an hour and a half. And I think we would be in a position to where we don't want those types of outcomes to occur. John makes a good point that the situations in which these occur may be very, very appropriate. So I'm hoping that as all of the entities look at phase 1B and 2, and they get into the details of this, they look at how the market helps improve reliability, because it should be taking that direction and not be a hindrance to reliability, because that would not be a good outcome for anybody. And I say that yeah, there's a fine line to make sure that there is resource adequacy and resource sufficiency, but we need to take a look at how the market continues to help reliability, because you can ask yourself, what is it that it's doing to improve reliability? It doesn't make the wires better. It doesn't make the physical infrastructure better. It does provide better access to resources. And I think that's hopefully a fundamental outcome we get.
I think so. Next we have Elliot. You have your hand up.
Well, I just wanted to just briefly say that I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's just hearing all of your perspectives. I think it literally, it meets the moment in terms of the level of reflection and thought that needs to go into this issue. And, you know, this topic is very, very important. It is potentially extraordinarily divisive, and it is so critical that this conversation acknowledges both sides of this equation. So I've really appreciated. We've heard it's not really an or, it's an and. It's a threading the needle between these incredibly important principles of accountability and responsibility, and not systematically leaning and meeting that and having consequences of doing that, but also really understanding that at the end of the day, we are all, as balancing authority operators and utilities, part of a shared interconnection, and we don't want to be exacerbating or punting reliability problems between each other. So I just think it's important. I really appreciate the engagement of the Board of Governors, the governing body, the MSC. I think, Scott, your comments are just spot on. Really appreciate that. And everybody should know that from the ISO's perspective, we really hear this and we are absolutely committed to bringing this to a good resolution, but we've got to get it right. So just wanted to put an exclamation point. Really appreciate the dialogue here.
Thank you, Elliot. And I think Anna McKenna wanted to make a comment as well. I see your hand up, Anna.
Thank you, Roger. Just wanted to add to this dialogue a little bit and some reassurances. Certainly, I'll echo Elliot's comments. This dialogue today reflects the complexity of these issues. We did take a little more time and did not bring to you a proposal precisely because of the challenges we are all discussing here today. But we are in the next phase going to look very closely to the measurements for uncertainty that are considered in the test. And we will definitely be looking at some of the issues that were raised by Dr. Harvey with regards to the use of that uncertainty in the test. We'll also be looking very closely to load conformance and how that implicates the EIM transfers that Dr. Harvey touched on, because that's a really important element to understanding what we do with the test and the consequences of the test, as well as the accuracy of the test itself. And I just wanted to also reassure folks as well, because there is an interplay with the pricing, as Dr. Harvey pointed out. We will be looking at how the pricing, both in the EIM as well as in the HAS market, as well as how the exports are influenced, by how we consider how the exports are out of our market are considered into the test itself, and how that implicates the transfers. And finally, I wanted to also reassure you all that we will be looking very closely at the short-term unit commitment process and what capacity, what unloaded capacity may be left there that's being counted or not counted accurately through the test. And this analysis, in my mind, is very important for us to start answering some of the other questions that you've all been asking here today, because we can't really get to some of those, whether we're striking the right balance or not without the additional analysis. So I just wanted to reiterate that. And then the other point I wanted to make is that I think it's really important that you all understand that when we talk about, phase 1B, we've taken the message very seriously that when we're looking at this issue of failure under emergency situations, we have to think about the consequences of the failures and what that means. And I just wanted to assure you that I think the message is clear. I'm glad that we pulled that from this decision today, and we'll be looking at that very closely. And I really appreciate all the guidance we received today on that issue.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Why don't we go ahead, seeing no more hands up, and now move to what I was premature with before, the Department of Market Monitoring. Ryan, are you available?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Roger.
Excuse me, Ryan, this is Christina Osborne. I just wanted to alert that my screen is frozen. So, Chris, I'm wondering if you can pull up the slides. It looks like I got disconnected.
Ryan, did you have a presentation, or is it merely just the slide for the topic?
I do not have a presentation. It would just be a slide with my name on.
So we will all imagine a slide that says Department of Market Monitoring, Ryan Kralinski, and you can go for it. Thank you.
All right, great. Good afternoon, Chair Bogwat, Chair Decker, governors, and governing body members. This is Ryan Kralinski from the Department of Market Monitoring. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. DMM generally supports the ISO's Phase 1 Resource Sufficiency Test Enhancements proposal, but we think there's a lot more work for the ISO and stakeholders to do on many of the contentious aspects in future phases. We think going forward, the design could really benefit from stepping back and more clearly defining the basic goal of the sufficiency test and what kind of requirements, what kind of consequences of failing the test could best meet that goal. Today, I'll try to summarize our views on 5 of the more complicated issues. So first, the ISO's proposal for reducing the amount of offline capacity that will count towards the capacity test. It's a clear improvement, so we support it. The capacity test clearly shouldn't count capacity that the scheduling coordinator has not made available for the Western EIM optimization to utilize, but it should count capacity that a scheduling coordinator made available to the optimization, which the optimization decided to make unavailable because there was cheaper power to use. We think there may still be some more nuanced ways to not count some capacity that scheduling coordinators have not actually made available to the real-time market. In particular, ramping limitations and maybe resources minimum downtime could use a closer look. So we recommend the ISO continue to work on enhancements in this area in future phases of this initiative. Next, in order to talk about our views on the other aspects of the proposal, I think we just start with DMM's understanding of the intent of the sufficiency tests. So the goal seems to be to incentivize participating balancing areas to procure sufficient capacity to meet their loads before the real-time market, and so that an area cannot count on leaning on the Western EIM to meet its load. there's a trade-off between costs and benefits of making the thresholds for passing the tests more stringent. So kind of similar to a balancing areas planning reserve margin. We don't think that there's a right answer to what those thresholds should be, but rather it's a policy question to be answered through debate and consensus amongst the balancing areas that are participating in the Western EIM. So moving on to the other specific proposals. First, the net load and intertie uncertainty adders. These were tacked on to the capacity test requirements in a rush last spring. We anticipate that's going to be difficult to get general consensus on exactly how resource and load uncertainty should be incorporated into the sufficiency test requirements. We think this warrants much more comprehensive consideration than the ISO and stakeholders have been able to give it to date. So proposing to temporarily not include any uncertainty adders in the capacity test requirements makes sense. Next, the very related issue of including load bias in the capacity test requirement. Load bias is primarily used by the CAISO balancing area in the hourhead market before the resource efficiency tests are run, primarily used in order to obtain extra capacity to account for uncertainty. Other balancing areas have different methods for getting extra capacity before the tests run in order to account for their uncertainty. And designing uncertainty adders for the sufficiency test, we think it makes sense for participating balancing areas to study the amount of extra capacity that all the areas try to procure to account for their uncertainty. But just simply adding load bias onto the capacity test requirements would at a minimum require some other carefully thought out changes to the market design in order to prevent significant increases in operator actions and other unintended consequences to market efficiency or reliability. So we support the ISO only potentially considering this in phase 2 as part of a more comprehensive look into how uncertainty should be incorporated into the test requirements. Next, moving on to the rule, new rule on imports, e-tagging transmission. The capacity test, it only currently counts hourly import schedules rather than hourly import bids towards meeting the capacity test. Given this starting point, it makes some sense as an interim measure to only count those interchange schedules towards meeting the capacity test if they have their transmission e-tag by 40 minutes before the hour. But we think the second phase of this initiative should more comprehensively consider for all Western EIM balancing areas how the capacity test counts import capacity that gets made available to the Western EIM. And then finally, this issue of emergency actions triggering a test failure. So if there is general consensus amongst the participating balancing areas that taking emergency actions should automatically trigger a sufficiency test failure, then I don't think we'd argue against it, but we definitely recommend that this proposal gets revisited in phase 2 when stakeholders reconsider the consequences of failing the sufficiency test. So in conclusion, DMM generally supports what the ISO proposes to do at this point in the initiative, but we think the 5 items I discussed today warrant more comprehensive consideration in phase 2. So thank you again for your time, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ryan. Any questions for Ryan Kurlinski? Raise your hand and I will call you as I can. Or just feel free to go if you're ready. ANITA, I think Chair Decker, I believe you raised your hand, and thank you for following the protocol on that. Let me turn to you.
And Ryan, you're off the hook. I don't really have a question. I just have a comment. I just want to comment that I think that DMM has really stepped up to look at this issue, and that the work that you're doing has really been appreciated by stakeholders. So just a shout out to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Decker. And I believe, although it's showing up kind of odd on my screen, so I apologize, I believe that Member Gardner, did you have your hand raised?
I do. Yeah. Can you hear me okay, Roger?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Ryan, so much for that overview of DMM's comments. And of course, I want to second what Anita said regarding DMM's ongoing analysis with regards to the RSE. I think that's been very helpful to market participants. And I know we've heard that time and time again, how much they appreciate that analysis. My question is regarding your, sort of toward the end of your comments, you were discussing the emergency actions that could trigger a failure of the RSE. And if I heard you right, you said that in DMM's opinion, if the EIM entities, prefer that outcome, DMM doesn't necessarily oppose it, but you obviously think that that should be further considered in the next phase as we look at consequences of failing the test. And I'm just curious if DMM has considered some of the similar issues that we've heard earlier today from the Market Surveillance Committee and from members of the governing body and the Board of Governors regarding potential reliability consequences of having such a measure in place. And if DMM didn't take an opinion on that, that's fine, but I'm just curious if you have additional thoughts to add to that particular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks. No, I think, we, in theory, I think we have recommended in the past, and we think in theory, ideally, you could have an out-of-market penalty to incentivize, all the balancing areas to procure enough capacity in advance to prevent leaning, to prevent entities from being able to count on the EIM, for their capacity needs. It's just, this is a complicated issue. I think as Member Prescott explained, this was something that seemed to be kind of a compromise at the foundation of EIM, that freezing the transfers was something that was kind of needed to get people on board. So it's one of those things where it's going to be complicated, I think, to try to get an appropriate penalty to get the right incentives to discourage leaning. We think that would be ideal. If it can't be done, again, I think if there is general consensus that a consequence of emergency action should be failing the test. We may opine on given similarly in theory about how something could be better, but I don't think we'd oppose that if that's what it takes to keep the EIM intact.
Okay, thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Member Gardner. Thank you, Ryan. As far as I see, there's no more hands up, and if there are no more questions, I'll give you a second to answer that, given there's delay. Any further questions or comments for Ryan? Okay, thank you. Our next item is to move to public comment. And operator, if you could reach out for public comment.
As a reminder, if you'd like to make a comment, please press #2 or click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And at this time, I don't see any comments.
Okay, thank you. At this point, Board of Governors and Western EIM governing body, if there are any further comments or questions before we would head to a motion, this would be the time. Member Konziolka?
Yes, thank you, Roger. I have a question. Do you want a discussion on this to take place prior to the motion, or wait until after the motion, then have a discussion?
Well, I think the discussion would appropriately go before the motion, so then everybody can vote with the full insight of that discussion.
Very good. Then may I go?
Please.
All right, thank you. I'd like to start off first with complimenting staff on the proposal that we've got today. I realize that this was initially planned for December, and rightfully staff looked at the issues in front and provided more time. I would also say that there was significant and substantive quality comments provided by those who have worked on this initiative with CAISO. As we've already heard, this is a challenging issue, and certainly it's more work. I'd also like to note that the memo that we had on the recommendation, I thought provided an exceptionally good overview of the issues and perspectives, and it was very helpful in going back through all the material. As ANITA and Jenna noted, DMM has provided significant data to participants over the last 6+ months. And I think this has led to much better understanding of all the issues that we've just heard about, and is helping to shape the ultimate outcome of what we get. All of the participants and entities are doing a lot of work on their side with that data to better understand. When this started off, it was, again, another outcome from August of 2020. And then, prior to 2021, the thought was, okay, we can add an uncertainty element to it to account for some changes. And it was going to be the answer. And I think what we've all seen now is that with this better understanding, there was a lot more going on that nobody really grasped completely well, and as we're seeing, still needs to be worked on. I find that phase 1 is widely supported. I didn't see anybody who said we should not approve phase 1A. That's before us today, and in fact, it's mostly get this done and get this done now, and let's move on to 1B. And most of those comments did the same thing. Most of the comments were laying groundwork for what needs to be done in 1B, and I think that's really well done. And I think there was good alignment across the spectrum of all of the interests and parties, and that they all agree on what needs to be addressed in phase 1B for the most part. There are some exceptions, and that goes along with phase 2 as well. And it really got summarized. We've made really good progress, but we're not there yet. So let's move on and let's get it done now. The key themes that I saw were the accuracy, which were just discussed, and the transparency and the impartiality or equitableness of it. I was going to talk a little bit more about it, but I don't think to now on, and I didn't see enough in there on the reliability and possibly the simplicity of things. But as John pointed out, the letter from NV Energy made a really good point, and it showed certainly one option that might be out there, and saying in certain cases, let's take a look at this. And I also thought it was interesting that the CCCA addressed reliability, and so they certainly saw some opportunities in this initiative to let's make certain we don't lose sight of that. All that said, I think what we have before us today is something that is easily supportive, and I am going to vote in favor of the proposal. So thank you.
Thank you, Member Konzioka. Member Garvin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I just have some comments that I'd like to share before we take a vote. So thank you for giving us all the time. I've already shared my thoughts about DMM's involvement and their enhanced reporting, which I think has greatly benefited this initiative, as well as enhancing the transparency of the data in the RFE, which was one of the things we were focusing on in this first phase. So I want to, reiterate my appreciation to DMM. I also want to thank the MSC for their incredibly comprehensive opinion. I thought it was really, really valuable and so helpful, especially to us decision makers as we are considering all of the elements that are under decision today. I also want to thank our stakeholders and how well I think that they were able to work with CAISO management and staff on this issue. I realize we're not there yet. We don't have the final solution, but the progress that has been made and the concerns that have been raised and that are going to be addressed, I think all of that has been handled very well. So thanks to all of you for that. The comments that I'm going to offer are somewhat narrow in scope. This initiative covers quite a few things and quite a few technical issues. So my comments certainly won't be comprehensive, but I did want to iterate just a few things here. And so, for purpose of background, I think that it's important to remind ourselves that the RFE is truly foundational, not just to EIM, but to EDAM. So it is so important that we get this right. But, as we're working to make the test more stringent, we're naturally going to make it harder to pass. And I think everybody accepts that, but where we're having problems is where we have unnecessary failures of the test, which is why we're here today. So I'm really pleased to hear that CAISO has adequately responded to stakeholder concerns thus far by suspending the net load uncertainty adder, by suspending the intertie uncertainty adder, by removing the demand response related penalties and allowing the EIM BAAs to reduce their load forecast to represent the dispatch of smaller DR programs. And finally, committing to a phase 1B so that we can move past these stopgap measures and implement improvements that can be a more permanent fixture of this test. And so as we start to move into phase 1B of this initiative, I just wanted to emphasize a few things. So with regard to the uncertainty requirements in the capacity test, there seems to be some consensus that the quantile regression methodology will be more accurate than the histogram approach, particularly with regard to its ability to more accurately account for the level of VERs in the upcoming hour. But I do think it's really important that we spend adequate time testing this methodology before adopting it. So that includes CAISO being able to work with EIM entities to be able to recreate the test so that the EIM entities can better understand the impacts to their systems. And I also think it's really important that CAISO undertakes a holistic examination of the uncertainty calculation that includes both intertie and net load uncertainty. And then with regard to addressing automatic failure of the RSE during certain emergency conditions, we've already talked quite a bit about this today, so some of this will be repetitive. But with this element of the RSE, I do think it's really important to balance that core principle of the RSE, which is that no WEIM requirement, while also keeping in mind how important reliability is. And again, those comments have been shared quite frequently today. And so while we now know that requiring EIM entities to notify CAISO when they take certain operator actions during emergency conditions is going to be error prone and lead to inconsistent actions, which we obviously don't want. We also don't yet know whether using NERC's Energy Emergency Alert System is the most appropriate approach, although I will say it would offer a more consistent approach, which is something we want to achieve as well. So I do think it's important that CAISO work closely with the market participants and with stakeholders in phase 1B to better understand the implications of such an approach and whether alternatives might be more appropriate so that we can ensure that we avoid any unintended consequences. And so with that, I just want to, underscore how much I appreciate stakeholder and market participants' involvement. Similar to Rob, I've heard pretty consistently that stakeholders support this proposal today, and so I will also be voting in favor. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Member Gardner. I think, Rob, did you raise your hand again, Member Konziolka?
Roger, I did, and I'd like to follow up on a comment that Jennifer just made, and it may require Greg to get back on the line if that's okay. I have a clarification, and maybe I just didn't hear quite right with what Jennifer said. So Jennifer, you help me out here. On the occasions under emergencies, I thought that the attestation was going to be for the demand response, and that the initial attestation proposed for emergencies was going to be studied further as in 1B. And I'd just like a clarification on that.
Greg, are you available for that?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, and that's correct. The attestation that's in this proposal is just related to the demand response. We had considered a prior proposal that was in our draft final proposal that that would be related to operator actions that would lead to the automatic failure of the resource efficiency evaluation. But we are not moving forward on that, for several reasons. One was, I think, has been noted, that we really wanted a clear criteria, and that wasn't, there's a lot of stakeholder concern that was not a clear criteria. And then, furthermore, defining what that clear criteria would be. So, this is one clearly we need more discussion on in phase 1B, but that's not included in what you're voting on today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Rob, thank you for bringing that up. And if my remarks weren't clear on that point, my apologies. What I was trying to do is draw a comparison and distinction between the NERC Energy Emergency Alert System and taking those operator actions, with the recognition that something like an Energy Emergency Alert System would offer us consistency, which the operator actions would not, but with the recognition that we're not considering that today. So thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Well, now at this point, seeing no more hands, with the indulgence of Chair Bogwat and Chair Decker, I would like to go ahead to the motion. Is that,
Roger,
you concur with that, Chairs?
So Roger, I couldn't get my hand raised. I've been trying to stay on mute because my doorbell's going off like crazy. but I do have a couple comments to make. So if you guys will just bear with me. I actually support where we are today, and I want to reframe a little bit. So while I think stakeholders clearly support where we are, they support where we are with a caveat that there is good progress and forward progress in the 1B phase, which it's because staff is going to continue on working and not have that pause to phase 2 that stakeholders saying we'll support this to get to at least move forward. So I support it because of that moving forward and knowing that staff is going to continue to work on this effort. I do think stakeholders have been very active in this process, and it has created a lot of compromise, a lot of collaboration that I think will bode well into not only this, but EDM. But I mean, I think everyone is also keeping their eye on the ball here that this is foundational. And the urgency and the immediacy has been supported, I think, by certainly the stakeholders, certainly by the body of state regulators. So, good for staff for keeping going and hearing those caveats. At the end of the day, this is very foundational as we look at, are we going to get to a West-White market? So we really do need to get this right. And I appreciate all the time and effort of stakeholders staying at this table, particularly given they're staying at the table with EDAM. So there's a lot going on, and I hope they will continue on this path of working through the 1B and into phase 2. So I also support this, but I want to be clear that there was definitely a caveat on this support, which was predicated that there would be continued work into a 1B. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Chair Decker. And at this point then, again, with the concurrence of you and Governor Bogwat, I will go ahead and read the motion. Move that the ISO Board of Governors and EIM governing body approve the resource sufficiency enhancements as described in the memorandum dated February 2nd, 2022. And move that the ISO Board of Governors and the EIM governing body authorize management to make all necessary and appropriate filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to implement the proposal described in the memorandum, including any filings that implement the overarching initiative policy, but contain discrete revisions to incorporate commission guidance and any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendment. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. And Governor Bogwat, your vote?
Aye.
Governor Bornstein?
Aye.
Chair Decker?
Aye.
Member Fong?
Yes.
Governor Galitova?
Aye.
Member Gardner?
Aye.
Vice Chair Konzioka?
Aye.
Vice Chair Leslie?
Aye.
Member Prescott?
Aye.
And Governor Shorey?
Aye.
Thank you, governors and members of the governing body. We have an approved motion at 5-0 for both bodies. At this point, I would like to, at the request of a couple of folks, I'd like to give us a 5-minute break. Let's try to keep it pretty succinct because we're still on schedule, but barely. So let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break and then we will reconvene. Calling the 4-minute mark on our 5-minute break. I think it's time to reconvene. I see everybody on video except for Governor Leslie. Oh, there you are. Thank you, Mary. Governor Shorey, are you on? And Governor Galitzba, I see you. Okay. Give Governor Shorey a moment. Governor Shorey, I see you are back. And I think with that, we have a full complement of the board and the governing body, and our forum is back, as well as full and complete, let's put it that way. Operator, if we can go ahead and resume.
We are live.
Okay, excellent. And the next item on our agenda is agenda item number 6, which is our decision on adjustment to intertie constraint penalty prices initiative. And this agenda item is a governing body decision with an advisory role. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. A board of governors decision with an advisory role for the WEIM governing body, and which is why we have it as part of the joint meeting today, if anyone had questions on that. And of course, I should have confirmed that Anna McKenna is back, and so I may be a little bit premature on that, as Anna, this is her item to introduce. Anna, are you available?
I am, Roger. Thank you.
Okay, thank
I am
you.
Back.
Excellent.
Full and present. Thank you.
Oh, and so, you were paying attention. There was going to be a quiz later. So.
Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to introduce today's decision item on the adjustment of intertie constraint penalty prices initiative, and I will be turning it shortly to Dr. Guillermo Bautista Alderete, Director of Market Analysis and Forecasting here at the ISO. He's going to walk us carefully through the proposal. But again, I did want to thank all stakeholders for their engagement on this initiative. As Guillermo will explain, it's important that we make this change prior to summer when conditions become more constrained. But I wanted to take a moment to assure you also that as part of our regular parameter evaluation, we will continue to evaluate the impact of this change. And as part of our normal processes, we will vet whatever we see, whatever observations we make with stakeholders. And if we have to make any other changes, either in light of this parameter change or anything else we might discover, we will be always ready and prepared to come back to you with any additional changes that might have to be made. But with that, I see Dr. Bautista Alderete is ready to go, and I will turn this over to him.
Thank you, Anna. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Members of the Board of Governors and the Western EIM governing body, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm here to present the proposal to change the penalty prices for intertie constraints. This is an item we identify as part of the summer 2021 performance analysis, and it's a very narrow and targeted initiative. Next slide, please. On July 9, 2021, there were 2 interties with heavy derates due to the bootleg fire in southern Oregon. The Malin and the Knob interties that enable imports into the CAISO from the North system were heavily derated in the real time. The intertie derates created a stressed system condition for the market to solve. The illustration highlights this condition with a line in red reflecting the Malin intertie limit. We can see that the large limit reduction from about 2,700 megawatts comes down to about 270 megawatts. The area in blue stands for all imports cleared in the real-time market as it happened. Ideally, all the area in blue needs to be at or below the red line. On July 9, effectively, the ISO market violated the intertie derated limits in order to get a solution. Based on the current market configuration, the market found that the least cost solution was to violate the intertie limit, and as a result, it scheduled imports above the intertie limitation. This is what we call a condition of overscheduling. Next slide, please. Overscheduling creates both reliability and market efficiency concerns. It's a reliability concern because clearing imports above the limit is not physically feasible and will require eventually our operators to manually curtail the imports after the fact. It's also a market efficiency concern because the market is clearing demand and exports with supply that is not actually available, which provides an inefficient market signal about the actual condition of supply in the system. This is more critical during periods of tight supply conditions, such as those of the summer months. Next slide, please. Let me explain briefly how is that the market allowed the intertie limit to be exceeded. This will also help understand the proposed solution. The ISO's market uses economic bids to clear supply and demand and to find feasible schedules and dispatches. However, to be able to handle conditions that are not feasible, the ISO market uses parameters that we call penalty prices. These penalty prices are a reference to the market clearing process of how to maintain the expected scheduling priorities and comply with the transmission and other type of constraints. These prices indicate which constraints should be violated first. Under extreme conditions, such as those of summer 2021, the market may encounter infeasible scenarios, and we may have to adjust certain inputs or violate constraints in order to be able to find a solution. And that sequence is determined and guided by the penalty prices. This includes the solution where the market could actually violate intertie constraints, such as what happened on July 9. Under the configuration for penalty prices that we currently have in our markets, the solution relied on violating the intertie limits, simply because the penalty prices for intertie constraints were too low in comparison to other penalty prices. It's important to note that the specific values that we use for penalty prices associated with intertie constraints are currently defined in the CAISO tariff. Next slide, please. With that background, we propose to increase the penalty prices for intertie constraints such that the market doesn't overschedule imports at the interties. With this change, the market instead will reduce infeasible imports to the point where we respect the transmission limitation, and potentially we will relax the power balance and reduce exports. This solution will be a more accurate representation of the actual supply that is available in the system and will provide our operators with a more realistic view of the system conditions. Therefore, this change will enhance the reliability of the market solution, especially and most needed when we have these tight supply conditions. The ISO ran a very short stakeholder process to explain the issue and the solution that we were proposing. No stakeholder opposed to the proposed changes. Through the discussions of the initiative, participants requested to provide simulation results to assess the impact of the change in the actual market solution. So in the final proposal, we expanded with a whole section of the market simulations using the actual events of July when we observed the condition. Then last week, we received comments from PowerX suggesting to delay this initiative due to concerns of unintended consequences and the need to potentially further assess this change. I can say that we understand this is a complex technical area, and through the stakeholder process, we provided the insights and implications of this proposed change. When we assessed the implications of this change, it was in coordination and consideration of the interplay with all other penalty prices that we have in the system. The simulation results provided in the final proposal reflect the impact of this change in the actual market solution. We agree that this type of changes can have unintended consequences given all the possible scenarios that we can find. And I can share that as of part of our normal process, we continuously evaluate the performance of the market. And we will continue to do so with this change. A testament of this process being in place and is working is this very same issue that we are addressing today that was identified as part of this ongoing assessment that we do for the market condition. We will be prepared to make any further changes as needed if we uncover any unintended or adverse consequences. And we have been transparent, and we will continue to do so in sharing with the stakeholders our observations and any actions that we may take. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we request that the Western EIM governing body support and the Board of Governors approve the proposed change to the intertie scheduling penalty prices to mitigate the condition for overscheduling. This change will enhance the reliability of the market solution, especially during these tight supply conditions, and will ensure that the ISO market respect the intertie constraints. Once approved, we are expecting to implement this change in advance of summer 2022. Having this implemented prior to the summer is critical because it will help us to mitigate the risk of overscheduling that could be very critical during the tight supply conditions of summer events. Thank you for your time. This is all what I have for this topic. I will be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Guillermo. At this point, before we go to questions, let's check for any public comment. Operator, can you?
Yep. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a comment, you can do so by pressing #2 or clicking on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And it looks like at this time there are no comments.
Thank you, operator. Governing body and board, if you have any questions or anyone from ISO staff, please raise your hand and we will address those. Governor Bagua?
Yeah, this is really short and I probably should know the answer, but the penalty price change that we're making, does it apply only in the RUC process or in the markets as well?
We apply those across the different markets that we have. That means to the RUC process in the day-ahead market. We also apply that to the hourly scheduling process that is called HASP and to the 15-minute and the 5-minute markets. Effectively, it has material impacts in the RUC process and in the HASP process, which are the processes in which we clear the interties that typically are hourly block schedules.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Bagua. Governor Borenstein, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, this is probably more a question for Anna than for Guillermo. Reading through the documents on this, I was taken with or struck by how deep in the weeds this is, and a little surprised that this was coming to the board until I saw that it's in the tariff, and that's why it's coming to the board. I assume there are many software changes that occur that we never hear about, even including important ones that stakeholders care about. Should this be in the tariff? Does it need to be in the tariff? How did we get here?
How many hours do you have for me to take you and walk you through that history?
Okay, well, how about forward looking?
Yeah.
Does it need to be in the tariff?
Well, it's a very good question. With MRTU, when we started the new nodal market, we had a process through the FERC process through which we worked through with FERC based on input by market participants, which of these parameters were pivotal because they impacted prices or schedules. And FERC came back and said, hey, any of these parameters that, really impact rates, terms, and condition of service, such as prices and schedules, they really should be in the tariff. And we had to strike a balance because you can imagine there are lots of different parameters that could be, considered to impact that. But we did strike a balance. This particular parameter, I believe, came in a little bit later through other FERC proceedings, but it's a process that's been really, it has evolved, if you wish, through the FERC filings. And market participants often request that they be in the tariff for purposes of certainty from a rates perspective so that it doesn't impact their schedules or their prices. So that's sort of a brief history of that. And we, until, we have reason to believe that this does not impact rates, terms, and conditions, it would be difficult for us to assert that they should not be in the tariff.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Seeing no more hands, I'll make sure as I scroll through my list, I see no more hands raised. At this point, I can turn to you, Chair Decker, to initiate the EIM governing body discussion as to exercising its advisory role and how it would like to do so.
So I would turn to the Board of Governors, and is there any comment regarding our advisory role on this particular initiative?
You mean the governing body?
Thank you, John. The governing body.
Thank you for interpreting, John. I was a little confused too.
I
knew what she meant. Since I guess I have the floor, I would certainly recommend we vote to advise the Board of Governors to approve this. And I'm glad that Guillermo read, or at least acknowledged, PowerX, and they had a comment, but it looks like they've taken that into account. So I'm satisfied with that.
Any other comments from the governing body?
I see Member Fong has her hand raised.
Hey, thanks. I too would vote to recommend that the governing body approve this, and I would I don't see a need for us to do it as a written, and I think they can just simply take our vote here, which they'll have to do because they have to act next anyway, for the record.
Thank you, Member Fong. Member Konziolka, you have a comment?
I'll just echo John's and Val's remarks. I support it. I thought this was very straightforward and a very reasonable response to address the issue.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, at this point, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, Roger, I was going to say, why don't you read our motion?
Excellent. Thank you. To move that, as discussed at the February 9, 2022 meeting, the EIM governing body advises the ISO Board of Governors that it supports management's adjustment to intertie constraint penalty prices proposal described in the memorandum dated February 2nd, 2022. Chair Decker, your vote?
Aye.
Did we need a motion?
We do. I'm sorry. I'm so excited. Moved. Can I have a motion for that, please?
So moved. This is Val.
Thank you. And second? Rob, I believe, a second.
Right.
Now let me try that again. I apologize, governing body and board. Chair Decker, your vote.
Aye.
Member Fong.
Yes.
Member Gardner.
Aye.
Vice Chair Konziolka.
Aye.
And Member Prescott.
Aye.
Thank you, governing body. The motion is approved to advise the board to support the initiative. And with that, let me turn to you, Chair Bhagwat, and see if you have anything further on your plate before I go to your motion.
Just do any members of the Board of Governors have any comments or thoughts? I do not.
Okay. Seeing no more hands, I will go ahead and present the motion. Move that the ISO Board of Governors approves management's adjustment to intertie constraint penalty prices proposal as described in the memorandum dated February 2nd, 2022, and move that the ISO Board of Governors authorizes management to make all necessary and appropriate filings with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to implement the proposal described in the memorandum, including any filings that implement the overarching initiative policy, but contain discrete revisions to incorporate Commission guidance in any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendment. We have a motion, please.
So moved.
You and
Second.
Thank you, Mary. Chair Bhagwat, your vote, please.
Aye.
Governor Borenstein, your vote, please.
Aye.
Governor Galitova.
Aye.
Vice Chair Leslie.
Aye.
Governor Shorey.
Aye.
Thank you, governors. The motion is approved 5-0. Next, moving to item number 7 on our agenda, we have our briefing on annual roadmap and 3-year plan, including an update on RDRR. And I will again turn it to Anna McKenna, our Vice President of Market Policy and Performance.
Thank you. And we do have here present today Greg Cook, who will walk you through the draft final policy initiatives that we'll be undertaking this year and through 2024. I did want to note that this is a follow-up item that we have shared some of this with you all before, but we always take the time and opportunity to come back, to sort of provide an additional briefing on the next steps. And Greg will walk you through any changes that you might have seen before. And with that, I will transfer this to Greg Cook, Executive Director of Market and Infrastructure Policy.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everybody. So, yeah, this is our annual briefing of the policy initiative roadmap, and this covers the 3-year period 2022 to 2024. I'll actually probably jog you through this because there's a lot of initiatives in here, and I think you're all fairly familiar with them. But, after my presentation, I'll be happy to go back if you want to dive into more detail on any of these. Be happy to do that. Next slide, please. So as a little background, we do the annual roadmap process each year, and it's really our comprehensive planning process for how we're going to evolve the ISO markets going forward. We develop the roadmap through an open stakeholder process. We use it to prioritize the policy initiatives we're going to undertake over the next 3 years. And it includes updating our policy initiatives catalog. The catalog is used to really help document all potentially identified initiatives. And that includes current planned and potential policy initiatives. And we obtain those policy initiatives from stakeholders as well as internally here at the ISO. And we'll accept proposed initiatives throughout the year, but we then provide updated catalog twice a year to reflect those new additions to the catalog. And we also update it to indicate which initiatives have been completed and are now no longer in the catalog. Next slide, please. So first, we'll start with the primary drivers. We use the primary drivers to really help prioritize our policy development going forward. Next slide, please. So this year we have 3 primary drivers that we identified, and these are similar to what we had last year, a little bit different. We have, first one is increased resource and load variability. And, this is happening as we're seeing more and more renewables on the supply side of the system, as well as more things like rooftop solar on the demand side, which is creating a lot more variability within the system. So we found that we've done a lot of enhancements to the real-time market over the years, and now we're looking really changing our focus to enhance the day-ahead market, as well as extend that day-ahead market to EIM entities, which would help leverage some of that regional diversity and we think would provide significant West-wide benefits. We're also seeing, increasing amounts of storage resources coming onto the system, particularly in the ISOPA. We've seen, I think, 2,500 megawatts already of new storage resources coming on the system. So we're really needing to look at our markets and make enhancements so that we can efficiently dispatch those resources in alignment with our operational needs. And then finally, we're seeing that there's great economic and reliability benefits of greater integration of the Western markets. And so here, I think as we're all aware, we're looking to extend that day-ahead market across a larger footprint so that we can openly and optimally manage access to the available transmission across the West. Next slide, please. So first I'll start with the market design and regional markets sector. And, you'll notice as I go through this, a lot of this is really focused on our regional focus and EDAM, and then a lot of the initiatives that we are also planning are really foundational to that effort. Next slide, please. So starting with the extended day-ahead market, I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. Again, we're looking to put that in place to, optimize day-ahead unit commitment over a larger footprint, also produce hourly energy transfer schedules among balancing authority areas, and really looking to capture that resource diversity benefits and improve transmission utilization across a larger footprint. And again, as I mentioned, this year's roadmap does reflect that high priority that we're giving to enabling participating in that extended day-ahead market by 2024. Next slide, please. So first of those foundational issues are the day-ahead market enhancements. And, this is a high priority initiative for us because it's really being used so that we can efficiently schedule supply to address net load uncertainty that occurs between the day-ahead and real-time markets. So we believe this will provide significant benefits, including improving market efficiency and price signals. We'll be able to now co-optimize a new product called Balance Reserves that is being designed to meet that uncertainty between the day-ahead and real-time market. We co-optimize that procurement with energy ancillary services in the day-ahead time frame. Also looking to enhance the residual unit commitment process so that we can also schedule downward capacity, making sure that we can address uncertainty in both directions. And finally, a lot of this is targeted towards reducing out-of-market actions, where we've seen an increasing trend of out-of-market actions in an attempt to address a lot of those uncertainty needs that continue to increase on the system. And so this will be a market solution to address those uncertainty needs. And again, this will play a very important role in setting up the foundation for extending that day-ahead market to regional entities. Next slide, please. Next major initiative that we have is the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative. This includes a number of items. First one would be looking at exploring scarcity pricing provisions. Again, this will provide significant price formation benefits, we believe, for indicating, when we're in tight supply conditions, that we have proper price signals. We also believe it'll provide greater incentives for storage resources to align their operations with operational needs. We've also originally committed to looking at system market power mitigation in this initiative. However, when we've been looking at developing the extended day-ahead market design, we think it's more appropriate to be looking at, we would be looking at balancing area authority level market power mitigation in that effort, which we think will address the system level market power issues as well. So we'll be focusing on that in the EDAM initiative. And then we've also committed to exploring fast start pricing. This is one thing that a lot of the EDAM stakeholders have wanted us to look at. We believe it's an important thing to look at, and we'll be doing that in the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative, and then also looking at some potential enhancements to the way we do the multi-interval optimization in the real-time market to address some issues that we've seen with dispatching storage resources and the pricing of those resources. Next slide, please. This one we've already talked about quite a bit today. This is the Resource Efficiency Evaluation Enhancement. It's called Phase 2, but I think this also includes a lot of the issues that we talked about would be in a sooner phase one initiative that will be starting immediately. There's a number of elements that we'll be addressing in the subsequent resource sufficiency evaluation enhancements initiative. We talked about consequences for failing the resource sufficiency evaluation, that whether or not we would include those upper operator adjustments. A lot of people call those load conformance, or load, also been deemed as load biasing, those issues. Looking to how we might want to address accounting for exports supported by EIM transfers or potentially speculative exports. There's been some requests to have further demand response monitoring when demand response is used to meet the resource sufficiency evaluation. Continue to look at whether we need further enhancements to account for storage resources. And then, as we discussed earlier today, the uncertainty calculations need to be looked at to see if we can come up with more accurate means of calculating the uncertainty, and how those should be incorporated into the resource sufficiency evaluation. And then, clearly be looking at other potential enhancements as well. Next slide, please. Next, we have the Transmission Services and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative. Is another, very high priority initiative for us to look at developing a forward process for releasing available ISO transmission for use by non-ISO balancing authority area entities. We're looking through this initiative, looking at a holistic, really long-term, durable type solution for real-through transactions, and have them the opportunity to obtain that high priority scheduling rights through the ISO system. And this also recognizes the need for and the dependence on those wheeling through the ISO system to serve external load needs. And then we were also, considering near-term enhancements, which we did in phase one of this initiative, that came to the board for a decision during the January board meeting. Next slide, please. Next, moving into the resource adequacy, transmission, demand response, and distributed energy resource and storage sector. Here, again, we've scaled back somewhat in this area because we have, a large number of initiatives in the market design and regional sector. Next slide, please. The first initiative we're looking at is the Resource Adequacy Phase 2 initiative, and this is really targeted at resource adequacy rule changes that are needed to align the resource adequacy program with the new day-ahead market enhancements that we're proposing in the day-ahead market enhancements initiative. This will be looking at how changes we need to make to bid price and must offer obligation, as well as potentially changes in the flexible resource adequacy framework. And then also looking at some enhanced must offer obligations for storage and conditionally available resources. Next slide, please. We also have an initiative plan for helping to facilitate the central procurement entity implementation. The CPUC earlier this year adopted provisions for a central procurement entity to procure local resource adequacy requirements for their jurisdictional load serving entities. So we'll be looking at developing enhancements on the ISO side and in our tariff so that we can accommodate that separate central buyer of resource adequacy resources that would be doing that procurement on behalf of CPUC load serving entities.
A question on that. What's the time frame on that?
Yeah, so they're planning on implementing that. So that will go in this coming fall when the procurement for RA is shown for the 2023 RA year. So that's coming pretty quick.
Greg, the CPUC CARB report that came out 2 weeks ago with the 120 gigawatts of clean energy broken down by various categories, is that overlaid in this in terms of how to achieve that? Mainly
no, not. Yeah, I would say not necessarily. No, this is really focused on. There's been a lot of disaggregation of the load serving entities, particularly with the community choice aggregators breaking off from the traditional IOUs. So with all these smaller load serving entities, the PUC found that it would be more effective and efficient to have a central buyer, particularly for meeting local resource adequacy needs. So, they would be setting, and they've essentially designated the Southern California Edison and PG&E to be those central buyers for their service areas to meet the local RA needs. But
Right.
That's what this is focused on.
Right, but what I'm responding to is your primary drivers for 22, the 3-year policy roadmap, and your second point about increasing amounts of storage resources. Does that also
Oh, yes.
integrating?
Yeah, so that.
Integrating
Yeah, so that.
variable resources and further, right, optimizing of those?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually several initiatives in here that are targeted towards that. It is because of those, the environmental goals and the procurement plan to meet those environmental goals is, instituting more storage resources as well as variability on the system. And, that's where we have a lot of initiatives that are targeted at evolving our markets so that we can effectively, facilitate those changes in the resource fleet going forward.
I just want to make sure we're not optimizing and not integrating renewable energy in an optimal manner.
I'm not sure I quite followed you there. I think, we're looking at how we can integrate. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, it's the way it's written here.
Oh, right. Yeah. So, I think the point is we want to, be able to, as efficiently as possible, integrate the new resources that are coming on the system, I think is the point.
Right. The new clean energy resources beyond
right.
Just battery storage.
Correct.
Good.
Okay. Next slide, please. We also are looking at an initiative for enhancing our backstop capacity procurement mechanism. We've found that there's been some issues with the pricing of the capacity procurement mechanism, particularly when we get into tight supply conditions, and that we may need more flexibility in how we set those prices when we need to do backstop procurement. So that would be examining those pricing provisions related to the soft offer cap. And we're also looking at whether we need to change some of our procurement authority to align with the changing operational needs of the system. As we're seeing that resource fleet changing over to the clean resources, again, the operational needs of the system are changing. We need to make sure that our backstop authority is in line with that. Next slide, please. We have an energy storage enhancements initiative, again, with all of the new storage resources coming online. We're looking at developing improvements to our existing storage model, as well as developing a new model that can work with state of charge of these storage resources, which is something a lot of the storage resource operators have asked for. Looking at developing exceptional dispatch provisions for storage resources so that when we need to exceptionally dispatch them to ensure reliable system operations, we're also providing appropriate compensation for that. Looking at some further enhancements to that co-located resource hybrid model that we developed a year or so ago. And then we also have some storage dispatching compensation related topics, as I mentioned, will also be addressed through the price formation initiative. Next slide, please. We're also looking at several enhancements to the interconnection process and to address a number of issues related to the generator interconnection and deliverability allocation procedures. These enhancements are looking to improve the efficacy of the existing process and primarily looking at how are we going to address our overloaded queue issues, and also looking at some broader process reform considerations to align our procurement processes. Next slide, please. And then, so with that, that gets us down to how we plan to conduct all of these initiatives. So we'll get into the draft final roadmap and annual plan. Next slide, please.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt. I know you're kind of on a roll here, but before we get into the roadmap, I actually
Sure.
just had a clarifying question on slide 37, and I probably should have brought it up at that time, but I was going to wait till the end, but now I'm worried it'll become irrelevant. So on slide 37, when you were addressing the RSE enhancements, I just wanted to make sure everybody was clear, because I know, I realize phase 1B, the whole concept of that is relatively new, so that's probably why it's not reflected in the slide deck, but just make sure that our stakeholders are on the same page. Some of these changes are actually going to be included in phase 1B, which is starting, immediately, essentially, and then phase 2 would take place after that, right?
Yes, that's correct, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear on that. So if I was changing, I would. Those changes did come, after these slides were submitted. I do have a piece on that when we get to the stakeholder comments, but you're exactly right. So these are a number of these will be handled in that phase 1B that's starting immediately.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thanks, Greg.
Yep, you bet. Okay, so we get into the roadmap, and we've changed the roadmap a little bit this year to break it down by sector. So when we're looking at over the next 3 years for the market design sector, primary focus would be on the day-ahead market enhancements, which, again, we've also included that as part of we believe that's also part of the regional market sector because it's supporting the development of EDAM as well. There is that initiative I didn't talk about, the dynamic line ratings. That is something that we're going to have to take on as a result of a recent FERC order on ISO RTOs taking on making sure that they have the ability to incorporate dynamic line ratings into their dispatch. So we'll be looking at that. And then we have the price formation enhancements initiative. Again, that's going to be a large initiative that will be starting mid this year. And then looking at further ahead, we pushed off some other initiatives like the VER dispatch enhancements and the AS deliverability and frequency response measures till later, so that we can have enough resources and focus on the day-ahead market enhancements and price formation initiatives. Looking into the regional markets, we have the clear focus here is on extending the day-ahead market, EDAM, also the resource sufficiency evaluation initiatives, and to your comment, Jennifer, this is where we have originally we were planning on the resource sufficiency evaluation phase 2 starting up after we did some analysis and workshops, but now we're replacing that analysis and workshops with that phase 1B initiative where we'll be looking at addressing some of those issues earlier in the process, as we've indicated. And then we have the transmission services and market scheduling priorities. Phase 2 will be another large focus of this year, and getting that up and running relatively soon and trying to get that completed around the end of this year. Next slide, please. And then in the resource adequacy area, again, the resource adequacy enhancements phase 2, that's to align with the day-ahead markets, the central procurement entity, as well as the CPM enhancements to be our focus this year. Next year, we do have planned an initiative on joint owned unit modeling that will be used to, support some of the EIM implementation. We have pilot projects going on now, but we have committed to more comprehensive market reforms related to that. We'll be taking that on next year. On the transmission side, again, a lot of focus on interconnection process enhancements. We've broken that into 2 phases, some that we can do more quickly and try and have them in place this year, whereas there's other more longer term enhancements that will be taken on in phase 2. On the DER and DER side, not a lot of activity on that this year. We do have the RDRR bidding enhancements, and a lot of that, again, is focused on ensuring that we have the right provisions in place to align with FERC Order 831, which has provisions to where we might increase the bid cap to $2,000 under certain conditions. We want to make sure that the dispatch of those resources is consistent with that. And then on the storage side, we have the two initiatives, the energy storage enhancements, which is looking at modeling enhancements as well as new models, and then the price formation enhancements to look at better pricing provisions to align the use of those storage resources. And then next year, we've pushed off the hybrid resource evolution initiative that we had originally planned to do this year, but we think it'd be beneficial for a couple of reasons. One, we have a lot of effort and work going on in the storage sector already, and we think it'd also be beneficial to have some more experience with those hybrid resources and how they're operating under the current market models, so that we could then help inform that evolution initiative further down the line. Next slide, please.
Greg?
So, yeah.
Yeah, can we go back to the other slide?
Sure.
That's a pretty big gap going from 22 to 24. And in 24, you got the arrow pointing out more like 25. So I would just beg to offer that perhaps you should rethink that.
You're talking about the energy storage enhancements?
The DR and DER.
Oh, the DR and DER.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And, I think that, a lot of this is also, it doesn't mean that there's no work going on in this area. A lot of this work on this area is going on more on the retail side and at the CPUC. In fact, working with them very closely on a DER DSO action plan. And so you see that it's planned on being completed in the 2024 timeframe. So our thought is that's, depending on the outcome of that, we would then be able to, take that up and look at what changes need to be made and evolutions on our markets need to be made to align with that action plan. So, even though it looks like there's a large gap here, it's not quite that way, because there's a lot of action and efforts still going on, but just not necessarily through ISO initiatives. So hope that helps. Okay, and then we can move on to the annual plan. So this is where could
I ask, are you going to take questions now as we go along, or do you want to wait till the end? It looks like there's a lot of people that have hands up.
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions now. We're pretty close to the end either way, so I'm happy to take them now. That's fine. Let's go ahead and take them now.
Okay, I don't know if I'm first in line. Roger, is it okay if I just go, or?
Sorry, I was still on mute. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm afraid this is just a very big picture sort of question. I was looking at these charts and I realized one of the things, and maybe it's the color coding, but first off, I will just say my general observation is this is a huge amount of work to accomplish in a relatively short time frame. And I couldn't get a sense of the prioritization of this in terms of what are the things we must do, what are the things that would be good to do or that we want to do. So if you could give me some feel, and I wasn't sure if the blue color meant didn't need to do it as quick, and the green is, no, this is critical, we have to get it done on this schedule. Could you give me some feel for how we're prioritizing all of this, just because it does look like it's a lot to accomplish in a fairly short time frame?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the color coding on these is really only there to indicate, try and do a differentiation at a very high level of what's a major initiative versus what's not as large of a scope of an initiative. And what we mean by that is the major initiatives, we have several elements to them, are going to require fairly extensive stakeholder processes and work to work through to come to proposals. And that's why, when you're looking at this annual plan, we even made the EDAM effort a darker green, try to show, there's major initiatives and then there's EDAM, which is, almost like, several initiatives rolled into one. So that's all we were trying to indicate with these various colors. But then, when you're talking about prioritization, this is really the result of our prioritization process. We actually did a lot of cuts on this. When we look at that 3-year roadmap, there were a lot of initiatives, particularly if you were to compare it to what we had planned last year that we were planning on doing this year. We pushed those off to future years to make room, for a lot of the initiatives we need to take on this year. And a lot of this is really geared toward, again, our goal of having the functionality for the regional EDAM market put in place in the fall of 2023, so that we can start onboarding new entities in 2024. So, it is a, pretty aggressive, challenging schedule, but, to meet that goal, we found that, this is really the plan we need to have. Because a lot of these initiatives that we have on here have interdependencies with that effort, and many are foundational to that as well. And then there's other initiatives that, we just have to do in order to, keep running the business, like the central procurement entity implementation is a good example of that. That's a change that's coming where we have to make, changes on our side in our tariff to make sure that we can accommodate, that new market participant when they come in next year. So, I hope that helps. And then there's, other areas like the interconnection process enhancements that, we have these, significant issues with our interconnection queue that, really need to be addressed. And so there's a lot of high priority stuff on here, but, this does reflect the results of, a fairly extensive prioritization process that we went through, and, trying to cut out everywhere we could. But, this is what it looks like where we ended up.
Thank you.
Yeah. So again, this is the annual plan, which, kind of drills down a little further, but, 16 initiatives on here. But again, this is, a lot of them will be finishing up relatively earlier this year, which will be, coming to you for a decision. And then, several again as we get into the late summer, fall time frame. So I'll stop there if you guys have any further questions.
Yeah, great. It looked like Member Konziolka has a question or a comment.
Greg, I've got 2 questions for you, and they may seem like arcane questions, but they have to deal with the challenges of interactions between the ESO system and neighboring. And the first one is on the interconnection process enhancements. Do you know if you're planning on including affected system reform or addressing that part of the interconnection process as part of this overall initiative?
That's a good question, Rob, and I'm not entirely sure if that's going to be part of the scope of the phase 2 of this initiative or not. So I'll have to look into that for you. Wait, I'm getting, I phoned a friend, and yes, that will be included in phase 2. Sorry.
I love it. Kind of to Jan's comment, wow, that's going to be another big challenge in getting that done, because that's not an easy one on the bigger projects that are more on the fringe areas. The other question has to do with the dynamic line rating initiative. That's a result of the FERC order. Do you know if that is going to be limited to the ambient adjustment, or is that truly going to do a dynamic line rating as opposed to the signal adjusted ambient?
That's another good question. I think, my understanding is our reading of the order is that it does go beyond just, ambient adjustments to the line rating. So, I think we're still, looking into exactly what's, required by the order, and, be looking at, how far we need to go to implement, what FERC's looking for going forward. But I think, they did talk about, both different, impacts on line ratings. And I think what we've determined is that it could go beyond just ambient line ratings, but I think we're still working through that.
I just, what comes to mind is when you think of the challenge with all path ratings that you have, And then again, you know, it was strictly just internal, but when you have the additional path readings, that really increases that threshold quite a bit. So that's another one that you know could grow. So thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You bet.
I see no more hands raised. Greg, are you done with your presentation at this point, or did you have more?
Well, yeah, I got it. Just a couple more slides. Let me wrap this up. This on its kind of next steps. If we go to the next slide. I just wanted to give you a heads up, you know, what's coming up in the March and May timeframe. So, you know, for the March EIM governing body and ISO board meeting, we've got 3 initiatives coming forward. One will be an update to our short and long start definitions. This will fall under joint authority. The reliability demand response resource enhancements is really the first phase of that. These are changes to align with FERC Order 831. That will also be under joint authority. And then the central procurement entity provisions we'll be bringing in March as well, but that would be an ISO board only decision. And then coming in May, we would have the remainder of the reliability demand response resource enhancements. Again, that would be under joint authority. And then the first phase of the interconnection process enhancements, and that would be an ISO board only decision. Next slide, please. And then I did want to give you a brief overview of the high level with the stakeholder comments we received on the roadmap. You know, I think, you know, we get this concern frequently, but, you know, I think we got it this year as well that, you know, there's concern that there's, you know, not necessarily enough bandwidth to complete a lot of the important initiatives that are foundational to EDAM. You know, again, as I discussed, we do believe that those initiatives are foundational and interrelated to EDAM and need to be, you know, completed in order for us to meet our goals of getting the regional market put in place by 2024. You know, it's definitely gonna be a challenging schedule, but, you know, we think that, you know, this is something we can move forward and be successful with. Next slide, please. And then, you know, we also had a lot of stakeholder feedback that really wanted us to begin the resource sufficiency evaluate phase 1B immediately. You know, we've talked about that, you know, previously today, and, you know, we'd agree with that, and we, you know, hopefully it's clear that we do plan to move immediately forward with that phase 1B, starting with a workshop a week from today on the 16th. And then we also had a comment that, you know, they would really like us to devote some resources to some of these less significant issues that are important, but, you know, have been, I guess I could say, lingering in our catalog for a while and have yet to be addressed. And, you know, we do consider those as we go through the prioritization process. But again, you know, it comes back to, you know, looking at the primary drivers and, you know, what do we really need? What's the highest priority evolution that we need to make for our markets in order to, you know, meet our objectives as we go forward. And that, you know, is the result of this process. We do, but I wanted to make it clear that we do consider those initiatives and we retain those in our catalog so that we can continue, you know, to consider those in future years. Next slide, please. And then finally, so we're wrapping up this process, you know, after the meeting today, then, you know, depending if we get new feedback that we need to incorporate, we'll do that and then post the final roadmap on February 17th next week. That's the end of my presentation. I'll be glad to answer if you guys have any further questions.
Any further questions for Greg at this point before I open it for public comment? Okay, seeing no hands and a few nodding heads of no. Operator, could we check and see if there's any comment, please?
As a reminder, if you would like to make a comment, please press #2 if you're dialed into the phone line, or click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And at this time, there are no comments.
Thank you, operator. Thank you, Greg. The last item on the agenda is an item that we have for future agenda items, which is whether there's any suggestions or requests from the board or the governing body for items that we should consider on future agenda. Any comments or suggestions? Hearing and seeing none, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, Board of Governors. Thank you, governing body. Appreciate your time and patience for a long afternoon today. And we are adjourned.